Chuckleenic. I'm a reenactor. And for 36 years, I used anything I learned in reenacting to bring history to life for my students and lure them into the subject. And I would wear the garb in class, and I'd have the music playing for whatever time period we were covering, and I'd bring stuff in for my students to handle to get into those different learning modalities. And not in the classroom anymore, so I had to repurpose myself. And I started a very pretentious sounding project called my Mission Odyssey, where I visited each of the sites of Alta California, like the missions of the Presidios and the Assistencias, and I did it in garb, and I told the tales of these different places. Well, I've covered all 23 of the missions and 11 Assistencias and a couple of Estancias and 5 Presidios, and that should be the end of it, but it's not. Because there's the Russian California part that really played in with the northern missions. And so I'm covering that, and I've already done one video and realized the more I tug on these history threads, the more stuff I keep finding. So I'm going to be talking more about Fort Ross and Bodega Bay and the Russian-American company. I hope you stick with me on my journey. My journey to the very first Russian outpost in California took me along Sir Francis Drake Boulevard and the Pacific Coast Highway. With the rest of North America having been claimed by imperial powers during the late 18th and 19th centuries, a number of empires and commercial systems converged upon the northwest coast. The Russian and Spanish empires simultaneously extended their reach into the region from opposite directions. Russian fur companies expanded into North America along the Aleutian Islands, reaching the Alaska Peninsula. 2 ships in 1768 under Pyotr Krenitsyn and Mikhail Levashev sailed to the Alaska Peninsula for the purpose of secretly assessing existing Russian activity and the possibilities of future development. The secrets leaked out, spread alarm through Europe, especially with Spain, which led to Spain colonizing Alta California and building a series of presidios and missions. What drew the Russians and later British and Americans was the sea otter. Sea otters have the thickest fur of any mammal, which made them a prime target. In 1775, at the port of Okhotsk, Siberia, sea otter pelts were worth 50 to 80 rubles as opposed to 2.5 rubles for sable. The pelts were called soft gold. The maritime fur trade was pioneered by the Russians and focused on acquiring furs of sea otters and other animals from the native peoples of the Pacific Northwest coast and natives of Alaska. The furs were mostly sold in China in exchange for tea, silks, porcelain, and other Chinese goods, which were then sold in Europe and the United States. When Russian fur hunting expeditions depleted the sea otter populations in the Commander Islands, they began to move on to the Aleutian Islands, initially trading with the Aleut inhabitants for otter pelts, but later enslaving them, taking women and children hostage, and torturing and killing Aleut men to force them to hunt for the soft gold. Russian hunting expanded to the south, initiated by American ship captains who subcontracted Russian supervisors and Aleut hunters. Even though Count Rozanov had passed on, he had gained valuable information, and that immediately encouraged the Russian-American company to contract with some Americans and hire their ships. One of the American ships basically was going between the coast of Mendocino County to the Farallon Islands, and they were grabbing sea otters, and they're having themselves a good old time. Well, the Spanish aren't real happy with this because they're looking at that as poaching. And they sailed into the northern part of San Francisco Bay, and that's when Luis Arguello, the son of the Comandante that Rozanov had met, the brother of Concha, he decided to open fire with cannons on the Aleuts who were sailing around in their Baidarkas, and that kind of scattered them. And that sounds like a loss for the Russians, except that when that American ship returned to Alaska, the reports were very encouraging as far as the Spanish have nothing north of the bay. And so Russian interest is growing. In January of 1809, Ivan Alexandrovich Kuskov, a senior administrator in the Russian-American Company, known more commonly as the RAC, was instructed by his superiors to go to Northern California, take a ship, take a crew, and to bury possession plates indicating the Russians' intent to colonize these places, or to at least, exploit them as far as resources go. And he ended up burying plates at Tomales Bay, San Francisco Bay, and Bodega Bay. And it was at Bodega Bay that he had the people on his ship establish a base. And they put together really crude structures, got that done by August. And, there were like 130 native Alaskans, which the Russians just loosely termed Aleuts. And there were 40 Russians who, and that's a loose term too, because there's a bunch of ethnicities that were running around in the Russian Empire, but Russian seemed to be like the generic term. And they established this port, which they named Port Rumiantsov. And by about October, they returned to Alaska with a couple of thousand sea otter pelts. So they're already seeing a profit. The next year, Gabriel Moraga, who had been doing a lot of exploring from the Presidio, and whose name showed up a lot in my Mission Odyssey series, he was sent north of the bay because he had been told of rumors. The rumors came from some of the Pomo who were native to the area of where the Russians were setting up, that there was Russian movement. And what it turned out to be was not Russians, but 3 American hunters that happened to come inland. And I guess the Pomo just kind of lumped them all together and said, hey, they look like you guys. And what Moraga did is he just very calmly escorted them back to Bodega Bay, or Port Rumiantsov, which was still at that time the only Russian settlement in Northern California. And then he kind of took the long way home and found the Russian River, and found the future site for Mission San Francisco Solano, and he probably found the site for Mission San Rafael. But he'd be back. Farallon Station was used as a sealing station and a base on the Farallon Islands off the coast of San Francisco for the Aleuts hunting sea lion meat. During hunting season, there'd be about half a dozen native Californians and a dozen Aleuts who were paid according to the number of pelts they brought back. The hunting group would form an artel under a Russian foreman. They'd live in rude earthen huts on the rocky slopes and regularly went hunting in their bidarkas, which could withstand the battering of the sea for only 3 months before needing to be repaired with sea lion skins. They would process their catch in their base camp for periodic shipment to the mainland. Bundles of seal and sea otter pelts, bird meat, eggs, feathers, resilient sea lion skin and sinew, salted and dried sea lion meat and blubber stored in small kegs, used both for food and as lamp oil. Members of the artel were rotated between Port Rumiantsov and the Farallons depending on the size of the sea mammal herds during the hunting season. The Russian-American company continued harvesting the soft gold in the San Francisco Bay area, actually entering San Francisco Bay and right under the noses of the Spanish missions and the Presidio there. The Spanish didn't like this at all. But now the story is going to turn south to the Channel Islands. The 4 northern ones were inhabited by the Chumash, who, because they were on the islands, were starting to speak different dialects. The 4 southern ones were inhabited by the Tongva. Now we're going to get into Island of the Blue Dolphin territory, which just kind of struck me by surprise that, I ended up connecting, because I read Island of the Blue Dolphins when I was probably in the 4th grade or something like that, and, I just remembered the book, and then I suddenly realized, wait a minute, these are connected, all this is connected with the missions, but it's also going to have a connection with Russian California and the Russian-American company conducting the fur trade. So the story of the Lone Woman of San Nicolas takes place on San Nicolas. Alright, and this is going to become the basis of the children's novel Island of the Blue Dolphins. Well, the people on the islands, we already talked about how their dialects are forming or subdialects are forming because they're living in relative isolation. Except for, traveling back and forth by the redwood plank canoes, the tomo. And what's going to make the people on San Nicolas different from the islands that are further north is these people are related to the Tongva, not the Chumash. So they're speaking a different language. And not only that, because of their isolation, their version of Tongva is going to become very different from that spoken on the mainland. So there's already that split. There's already that isolation there. And in 1814, some Aleutian seal hunters ended up coming to the island of San Nicolas, and they apparently negotiated a deal where they could hunt seals. They were working for the Russian-American company. They could hunt seals, and they would end up paying the Nicoleños, as the Spanish would call them. And, according to one version, the Aleutians say one of their people was murdered by one of the Nicoleños, and so retribution was sought. The other version is the Aleutians ended up killing most of the men and raping most of the women. So that's around 1814. When the Russians and Aleuts sailed the brig Ilmena back to Alaska, the Nicoleños were left to their isolation for decades. Out of the 1814 massacre of the Nicoleño people of San Nicolas Island by RAC Aleut hunters, a saint of the Eastern Orthodox Church was created. A group of Russian employees of the RAC and their Aleut seal and otter hunters were captured by Spanish soldados while hunting illicitly for seals. One, baptized Peter in the Eastern Orthodox Church, refused to deny his Orthodox faith and to convert to Roman Catholicism, was tortured and killed. He was canonized by the Eastern Orthodox Church in 1980. One of the things you have to understand is the Spanish were not outraged by the slaughter of the Nicolanos. They were outraged by the poaching conducted by the Russians. In 1835, word has traveled that there's some people on the island of San Nicolas. And apparently there's not very many of them. And at this point, you had secularization take place. So an idea of a rescue mission was mounted, but it was ended up being paid for by the mission of Santa Barbara. The mission of San Gabriel, which would have been a more likely place to take any of the Nicolanos because of the Tongva connection, there is no mission San Gabriel anymore. It's been secularized. And so it's decided to rescue the people and rescue might not be the right word, and move them to the mission of Santa Barbara. In 1835, the crew of the ship Peor es Nada ended up removing the remaining survivors on San Nicolas. So the Nicolanos, or maybe 20 of them, ended up being taken to Mission Santa Barbara. So the woman who didn't make the evacuation, or the girl who didn't make the evacuation, she lived for 18 years in isolation on San Nicolas. So there's nobody to talk to. All right? She's totally alone. There was a version of the story that said that she was going to board the ship, but realized her brother wasn't on the ship and ran back for him, and the ship took off. But that, when you have to consider, this is the Victorian era, that facet of the story didn't get added until about the 1880s, and maybe that was romanticizing it. So she's living in isolation, and sailors would talk about passing near the island and they would see a woman on the cliffs, and there was this ghostly image. In 1853, there was a Santa Barbara fur trapper named George Nediver who ended up making 3 attempts to find the lone woman of San Nicolas. His first 2 attempts failed, obviously, because he made a 3rd attempt. And he took her back to the mission at Santa Barbara, which, even though the mission was supposed to be secularized, it still pretty much was operating. And no one spoke this woman's language. She was like a drop in the bucket. Someone who was a cruzeño had said that he sort of understood what she was saying, or when she would sing a song, he translated it. But considering she spoke a version of the Tongvan language and the cruzeños were speaking a variant of Chumash, it's pretty unlikely that he understood the words. Of course, I have way too much stuff. I keep finding things that I want to talk about. So I hope you stick with me on my journey.